Bryan and Brian. 1. Having grown up on nearly opposite ends of the United States, Mary in Arizona and cousin Beth in Maine, the women were aware of one another, but despite the close blood ties of having mothers who were identical twins, even as children, the nearly 3,000 miles that separated Phoenix from Augusta made visits between the two families rare. With the deaths of first grandmother Anne and then grandfather Joaquin, while the girls were tweens, rare visits became nearly non-existent. And when Liz married Joseph and moved to Iceland straight out of college, and then Mary married Kiwi Zach and moved to New Zealand 2 years later, the nearly half an earth that separated them made any physical contact an extremely high improbability. But the world is, of course, filled with the most unlikely of happenings. As unlikely as a chance meeting between Mary and Liz might seem, an even more unlikely event would be the two cousins giving birth at exactly the same hour on exactly the same date. Nonetheless, two clocks chimed 12 on the first day of a new century as two distant cousins were born. Mary and Beth, each vaguely aware of the other's impending parenthood via communications with their respective parents, independently delivered two Bryans, or should that read Bryans, unto the world at the stroke of midnight as yet another in a long list of O1s blossomed into a fresh century. The boys, sons of two cousins whose mothers were twin sisters as outlined above, had a kinship few would describe as distant, as even first cousins once removed, whose grandmothers are not twin sisters, share a relationship half of a quarter of a half of a half, or nearly 13% the same as one another. Rather, the two boys were distant in time and space. With midnight's arrival, Mary Brown, after laboring long and hard in Wellington, gave birth to son Bryan, while her cousin Beth Gunnarsson brought forth Bryan in Reykjavik at precisely the same time, but 13 hours later. By the time Beth delivered her and husband Joseph's bouncing baby boy bundle, Bryan, Mary, and husband Zach were half a day rested from the parturition of Bryan's special delivery. For exactly 3 years, the Bryans grew and flourished, and on January 1st, 2004, exactly 1,095 days after the birth of the boys, Mary, Zach, and Bryan boarded a plane in Wellington, while Elizabeth, Joseph, and Bryan hopped on a separate but equal plane in Reykjavik. Mary, Zach, and Bryan were headed to Puerto Vallarta to partake in a working vacation, meaning that Mary would work while Zach and Bryan luxuriated in the tropical paradise. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, Joseph, and Bryan were temporarily fleeing Iceland, whose capital was currently veiled in darkness for all but 4 hours and 23 minutes, though that 17% of the day the sun shone was a full 15 more miserly minutes of daylight than Reykjavik deigned to deliver with every winter solstice. Whether work or pleasure, off the two families went, each unaware that they were both headed to a rendezvous in Puerto Vallarta. Familial resemblance of the two women, and subsequently their two sons, was such that the two couples could easily have reduced by a third the number of passports the Browns and Gunnarssons carried, had geography and the law allowed. Both first cousins Mary and Beth, as well as cousins once removed, Bryan and Brian, had uncanny resemblances to one another. Mothers and children had the same green eyes, the same wavy chestnut hair, and Mary had grown to just over 5'10", while Beth's growth had stopped just shy of that height. And 3 years postpartum, both mothers had fought hard and successfully to reach weights slightly lower than their pre-pregnancy benchmarks. Like their mothers, the Bryans were tall, both boys hovering at 39 inches and 40 pounds. A chance observer could easily mistake Mary and Elizabeth for either one another or think them a pair of twins, as was also the case with Bryan and Brian. In contrast to this disconcerting resemblance of mothers and children, telling the husbands and fathers apart was easy, what with Kiwi Zach's café con crème complexion being markedly different than Joseph's skin of snowy Icelandic whiteness. With Zach's Maori complexion and shorter, stockier build differentiating between him and Joseph's long, lean, ropey, muscled physique was something even a blind man could see, especially with Joe's fierce, Viking-heritage red beard. The men would never be mistaken for one another, but discerning between the two boys and their mothers required acute observation. And acuteness of observation is a quality few in this world seem to possess.